Three. Happy Sabbath, Mount Vernon and visitors. We want to welcome you to another Sabbath school lesson. I'm joined by the gifted and illustrious Dr. Cox. And Dr. Cox, will you please give us opening prayer?
Well, dear Lord, we're so thankful for another Sabbath morning and another Sabbath morning that we can study your word. We thank you for all of the listeners to Sabbath school this morning. As we study your missionary journeys on earth, it just touches our heart to see what you've done and how you've started this missionary work and the disciples, how you taught them. And we pray, dear Lord, that we may continue until you come. Amen.
Amen. So, Dr. Cox, the title of this week's lesson, we're studying week 6, is Inside Out. What in the world are we talking about? Inside Out.
Lesson 6,
Maybe there's a clue.
Inside
Maybe
Out.
there's a clue in the memory text.
Yes, it says there's nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. Mark 7:15. So this week's lesson, we are studying Mark 7 and the first half of Mark 8. And there's several stories here that really touches the heart. It comes close to home. Okay.
So the essence of the memory text is that the things that are inside are what corrupt us,
And not
and less so the things outside. But the things that are outside, he's really speaking within a particular context, right? Because there are some external things that can corrupt. There's some things that can influence you to
yes,
do to be
yes,
evil.
yes,
But
yes.
within the context of this conversation, he's talking about those things that can corrupt from inwardly versus the alleged things that can corrupt outwardly. Those
Outwardly.
alleged things are based on tradition, and we'll take a look at that.
Okay. There's an important point here to make, despite the miracles.
Yeah, so on the fourth paragraph says that Mark 7, with another healing, reveals the important truth that however impressive miracles can be, they alone are not enough to open hearts to truth. And Dr. Cox, you know as well as I do, is we've been studying in our Bible study class, we're in Revelation chapter 13, and we know that in the last days, Satan is going to be moving with miraculous power to deceive
The very
untold
elect.
throngs of people, right? So miracles sometimes can be a Christian's worst enemy because a lot of people are going to be deceived by miracles. Miracles have their place,
Mm-hmm.
but we can't put place too much importance on them. And we'll see
Right,
Jesus kind of instruct us in that
right.
regard.
And the religious leaders saw all of these miracles of Jesus, but they were bent on rejecting him anyway. So what good did the
It
miracles
didn't
do
matter, it
them?
didn't make one bit
Yes.
of difference.
Okay, there's one little point here. In Mark 8, the study looks at the significance of bread as a symbol of teachings and traditions. These stories contain great lessons about the meaning and practice of religious life. We'll get to that. So let's begin Sunday's lesson.
Now, before we get
Okay.
to Sunday's lesson, so that last sentence that you just talked about in terms of bread being a symbol, and
Yeah.
all throughout this lesson, what we're going to see is disciples, Pharisees, and other people not really understanding what Jesus is talking about because they're focused on literal meanings,
And
whereas
not,
Jesus
yes,
is
deeper,
dealing with the symbolic, deeper meanings
deeper
to
meaning, not the
illustrate a
superficial.
higher spiritual
Right.
truth as opposed to taking a look at the surface or the literal, because people will sometimes on purpose
Yeah.
misconstrue those things. And we'll see that playing out. So now we can
You
go to
gotta
Sunday's
dive deep. You
lesson.
gotta dive deep. You can't stay on the surface.
That's exactly right. So let's go ahead
Sunday's
and
lesson,
dive into
human
Sunday's
tradition
lesson.
versus God's command. And we're
Yes.
asked to read Mark 7, 1 to 13. What relevant truths are presented here? Let's read 7, 1 to 5 first. Let's chew that over
Okay.
first.
It says the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were unclean, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with unclean hands?
Well, seems like a normal thing to wash your hands before you eat. What's the real issue here?
Well, once again, there's a difference between the surface and the deeper, or the literal and the symbolic. And so what the Pharisees were really asking about, they weren't asking about, okay, you just got finished playing in the mud, should you not wash your hands? It wasn't a washing to physically cleanse. It
Hmm.
wasn't a hygienic cleansing.
Hmm.
It was a ritual cleansing. And the ritual cleansing has nothing to do with hygiene. It has
So
everything to do with religious symbolism.
where did they get these ideas from? Where did these ideas come from about washing hands and the
Well, the lesson says that in Jesus's day, many people in that land were very concerned with ritual purity. During the time between the Testaments, the idea of washing hands in order to remain pure was extended to the common people, even though these rules originally applied only to the priests in the Old Testament. So, to give an example, um, I'm a sinner. I go to the sanctuary. I bring a lamb. That lamb's got to be sacrificed. I've got to kill it. The priest catches that blood and applies it in the holy place of the sanctuary. Before the priest goes and does anything
yeah,
with that, he goes to a laver or a basin and he
cleansing ritual?
ceremonially washes his hands. Now,
Hmm.
ironically, me, the sinner, the one who's guilty, the one who's stained by the sin, I don't wash my hands.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so we see here that this is initially only for the priest, but whether it's the ceremonial cleansing or various laws dealing with Sabbath observance or various laws that dealt with tithing, what happened was the scribes and the Pharisees, they made that list of rules bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where they become so encumbered by the do's and don'ts that they miss completely the spiritual and the symbolic significance of the things that they were doing.
But the sanctuary rules were a teaching device in the great plan of salvation.
Right?
So it seems as though the Pharisees took those rules and applied them to the common people. And here they're applying them to Christ's disciples.
Yes, they
But
are, without a
so,
doubt.
because their religion is centered around these rules.
Yeah, because the rules are something that are tangible. And,
Right.
and, and,
That's
and you know, and the rules don't require faith.
yeah.
Either you do it or you don't do it. And so because they're literal in their interpretation,
Hmm.
and they don't understand the symbolic nature of the teachings,
Yeah.
they miss the boat. And we've seen this already
Yeah.
in other portions of the book of Mark.
Yeah. So they even carry this matter so far that, if they went to the marketplace and buy vegetables or whatever, they would clean the food when they come home, lest the Gentile touch the food in the marketplace and
Right.
become unclean. Right.
So if a Gentile touches the food in the marketplace, it becomes unclean. But if a Jew touches that same food, it's
Hmm.
not. So it's not really about hygiene. It's
Yeah.
about the ritual or the symbolic cleaning,
It's
right?
human rules, surface religion.
Yeah, it's
Right.
human rules, but it's an exaggeration or misapplication of what were initially divine rules.
Okay, let's see what Jesus had to say about that in verses 6
Okay,
to 8.
so Dr. Cox, so what is Jesus's answer to their question? Their question was, here's the question. The question was, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with unclean hands? So what is Jesus's answer?
He says, well, he answered and said to them, well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites as it is written, and in vain they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandments of God, that's the Old Testament regulations, right? You
Yes.
hold the traditions of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many such things you do. So he doesn't directly answer their question. Instead, he defends his disciples in a two-pronged response here.
Right.
First, he
So
says, Isaiah quotes, you honor me with your God with your word, but your heart is far from me.
right. So he's criticizing um their religious activity. Right.
Piety, yeah.
And so basically what he's saying is all those things that you do, all those religious things that you're doing, they're really worthless because what you're doing is based on the traditions of men, but what I'm all about are the
Yeah.
commands of God. And
Right. So they
this whole thing with the unwashed hands, that's not a command from God. That's your tradition that you have.
so their human traditions replace the word, yeah, they replace the divine commandments.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
supplant the divine commandments. Absolutely. Right.
Oh, okay. All right. So
Now, but before we go any further, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about this. Um, the supplanting of um, God's commandments with human traditions is a problem back in that day, but it's also a problem today as well. So we see, for example, in the first day world, um, Sunday has been trumpeted as the Lord's day out of tradition, but it's not part of God's commandments.
right.
Right?
Mhm.
And then lest we say that that's just a first day issue, as Adventists, we have issues with that as well.
Yeah, we do have issues. We have several our own issues.
We
We
have
have
our own
issues
we
with
have our own traditions, right? And so I remember,
vegetarianism is one of them.
yeah,
And another one is that listen, we got to get to Sabbath school even if we leave the family behind.
well, that I keep that tradition, but anyway. But I was gonna say, there are times where if someone's sick, it's appropriate to either buy medicine or
Oh yeah,
take somebody to a doctor on the Sabbath. But sometimes
yeah,
if you saw me coming out of Stop and Shop on your way home from church, you would be like, "Oh, what is Brother Davis doing buying stuff on the Sabbath?" But you
yeah,
don't
yeah,
know,
yeah,
if
yeah,
the one of my kids has an allergy or a headache or is bleeding profusely.
yeah,
We
yeah.
don't know, and so we have our traditions as well. But what God is really saying is this: you put too much weight on your traditions and you don't put enough weight on God's commands. And
Okay,
that becomes a problem.
let's look at the second part of Jesus'
Yes.
reply. He continues in verses 9 to 13. He said to them, all too well you reject the commandments of God, that you may keep your own teaching or your own tradition of men. For Moses said, honor thy father and thy mother, that's the fifth commandment. He who curses father and mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father and mother, whatever profit you may have received from me is korban, that is a gift to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father and mother. In other words, he's excused from helping his father and mother,
Yes.
making the word of God of no effect through your tradition which you have handed down. So, and so many other things you do.
So what we
So, in other
see
words,
here,
yeah, hmm
so on both of these prongs, Jesus is using the scriptures.
yes, there
So
was
at first he's
yes,
using Isaiah, but now he's using Moses. And what he's saying is this, you guys twist the commandments,
yeah,
right? And so he gives the example of the fifth commandment, but because he's using the fifth commandment, what he's really doing is validating all the entire Ten Commandments, right? And what he's saying is, you guys twist the fifth commandment for your own benefit. You're saying honor your father and mother. That's what God says. But you're saying, you know what? Whatever help I would have given you, it should go
belong
to
to
the church. And
right.
because the church needs me to get to Sabbath school on time, the church understands that I need a brand new BMW. So whatever I would have given you that was the cost of that $70,000 BMW, that's really
Yeah,
devoted to God. And
to God.
and the Pharisees like, okay, I'm good with that. But Jesus said, no, I'm not good with that.
Yeah. So this is a tradition that they had that Jesus is pointing out that undermines the fifth commandment.
Right.
Right. In other words, so they're hiding their selfishness under
Absolutely.
this cloak of dedication to God or
Right.
things to God. Right.
And and the
So and so
bad thing
so that
about that is he says you do many things like that. It's not just
yeah, yeah,
the command,
yeah.
the fifth commandment. You guys do a lot of stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. And that's tradition too. It's we have this tradition, this collective wisdom of those before us, and they lay down this commandment that we follow, even though it's not biblical. It isn't always accurate. Right.
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 I don't want to get in trouble, but I think about like one of the traditions that has tripped us up as a church is music.
Yeah.
And then once upon a time, there was like this thing in the church where you couldn't have drums in the church. Now, mind you, you got all of these examples in Psalms of all of these instruments, including drums being used. And people are like, well, no, it doesn't really mean that. But I'm like, well, yeah, it kind of does. And so our tradition of what we consider acceptable music, right? It can be narrowly defined by our tradition. But listen, David danced so hard, his clothes fell off, right? So it had to be some kind of music that was being played.
You're hitting close to home, Brother
I don't
David.
mean to do that. I don't mean to do that. I don't want to mess up the Cox home, but I couldn't resist it.
Okay, so the answer to the Pharisees' question, the response of Jesus implies that he does not find convincing their insistence on hand purification as necessary to be in accordance with the will of God. Instead, his response clearly supports the commandment of the law against over human tradition. Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Monday's lesson:
Monday's lesson. Okay.
clean hands or clean heart?
Oh, that's a good question, right?
Yes.
So,
And so
uh,
we go to Mark 7:14 to 19. It says that Jesus turned to the other people around him, right? And he gave
mhm.
this advice to the other people around him.
Yes,
So
right.
the Jewish leaders, after he dealt with them and they couldn't refute what he just said, he turned to the people, the crowd, and Mark 7:14 to 19,
Right. And
he
it
says,
says,
when he
again,
called, go ahead.
okay, again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. Are you so dull? He asked. Do you not see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? For, for it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, and then out of his body. In saying this, Jesus declared, uh-oh, all foods clean.
Hmm.
Dr. Cox, that
Yes,
means I can
this
have
is
some shrimp scampi, I can have
it
my
says
pork chops.
this is a
It's all
conundrum
good.
for many people here.
That's
I
right.
mean, is he doing away with the Leviticus 11 distinctions here of clean and
Right.
unclean food?
So the lesson asked about is he getting rid of the Leviticus 11? And I wish that instead of referring to Leviticus 11, that he referred to Genesis chapter 7. Because in Genesis chapter 7, God makes a distinction between clean
And
and unclean
unclean.
animals during the flood, which is before the law, which is before Moses, which is before Abraham, which is before any Jew. And so
Yeah.
sometimes people say, if you don't eat pork, that's a Jewish diet. It's not. It's a godly diet. And so the question is he really talking about foods
Food, yeah.
when he's
Is he
talking about
declaring
something
all foods
else?
clean? Is he saying
Yeah,
all foods are clean here, or is he addressing the traditions of men? He's not attacking Moses' statement. They were the ones who twisted the law.
right. So he can't
Right.
be attacking Moses' statement
Yeah.
because earlier when he's quoting Isaiah, he's using the scriptures, and then when he quotes Moses in respect to how the Pharisees misapply the fifth commandment, he's not getting rid of Moses. That can't
Yeah.
be it. So
Yeah.
what it is he's really trying to instruct them about the importance of the deeper issues, the inside
Yes.
out issues, right?
Yes, yes.
So
They have this thing, among themselves of touch defilement, right? If you touch
exactly.
something unclean,
Right.
you
Right.
know, yes. So they
So
had this thing about it. And so if you touch a Gentile, you'll be defiled.
right. So touch defilement's a big deal to
Yeah.
them. So
Yeah.
the lesson says what Mark 7:19 means when it says that
Jesus
Jesus
touched.
cleanses all food is not that food laws are abolished, but instead that the tradition of touch contamination that the Pharisees had made was not valid. And once again, if you take a look at the surface or the literal meaning, when he says Jesus declared all foods clean, that word clean is in quotation marks.
Yeah.
It's about the ritual cleanliness, not the healthiness of the food. And
So
so
he's,
the ritual cleanliness basically means, is this acceptable to God? Right?
yes. So you're saying that he's trying to get rid of this whole idea of touch uncleanliness because he knows that Jews and Gentiles got to get together,
Right.
right? And Jews and Gentiles can be in the same church together, right? So,
Absolutely.
right. So, they narrowed it down to exclude the Gentiles,
Well,
right?
what they were really trying to do was initially when they asked that question, basically, do your disciples, keep the traditions of the fathers,
Yeah,
or um, why don't they eat with these? Why do they eat with unwashed hands? Really, it's a criticism of Jesus,
yeah,
right? So, like, if my kids are wilding out, you know, you're gonna look at me and say, "Why don't you keep your kids under control?" And so they're now attacking Jesus through the disciples. And what Jesus is saying is, your attacks don't really mean anything
yeah.
because what you're really focused on is the wrong thing.
Things, yeah. He
And when,
said,
and, and when people try to argue that, okay, now because of Mark 7:19, I can eat pork, you're doing the same thing the Pharisees are doing. You're focusing on the wrong thing.
and
He's talking about what's going on with your heart.
yeah.
It isn't, he's not talking about diet.
And Jesus also pointed out that they live in a very narrow world that excluded the Gentiles. And Jesus
Absolutely.
is saying it doesn't matter if a Gentile touched the food. It's not, the key is your heart. It's not your stomach.
That's exactly right.
Right.
It's so I'm glad you mentioned that because when it says in verse 18 and 19, are you still so dull? He asks. Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? For it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach. So the issue really has nothing to do with the physical, the stomach. It has to do with the spiritual or the heart. So
And
what
what
makes
comes
your
out,
heart
yeah,
unclean?
yes. What comes out of you messes up your spiritual life.
Inside out. That's the
That's
whole
right.
point,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
And so once again, we have to make sure that we try to keep our focus where Jesus has his focus, right? It's on the spiritual issues that he's really
And
talking about
Jesus set the
here.
example for them. Remember when he touched the unclean man when he was there before the Decapolis, right?
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Right. That's
Right.
right.
And
Yeah.
so
If he touched
he touched
Gentiles, he
lepers.
said, yeah.
But see, here's how we know he's not talking about diet. Because even though Jesus touched those unclean people, you have never seen in the scriptures where Jesus ate unclean animals.
Yeah, true. Yes.
You've seen him eat the Passover lamb, you've seen him eat
Mhm.
fish,
Yeah, but not,
but you've
yeah,
never seen him eat an unclean animal,
that's right.
right?
So it's a false notion that they had that they were contaminated if he came in contact with Gentiles.
Absolutely.
Right. So, or even through the food that Gentiles touched. All right, let's move on. Read Mark 7:20-23. What did Jesus say causes contamination of a person?
Okay. He went on. What comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. For from within, out of the men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean.
So what makes you clean or unclean is what's in the heart. Yeah,
Right.
right.
So he's talking
So
about spiritual purity as opposed to
yes.
what's on your plate.
I like the last paragraph. It says, when the reference to the fifth commandment in Mark 7:10 is included in the vice list, every commandment of the second table of the Decalogue is there. Further, Jesus refers to vain worship in Mark 7:7, the breaking of what is at the heart of the first four commandments of the Decalogue. Thus, Jesus stands as a defender of the law of God throughout this passage. So he is
Yeah.
affirming the Ten Commandments in that
He's
statement.
affirming not just the Ten Commandments, he's
Yeah.
affirming godliness. There
Hmm.
is no commandment against arrogance.
Yeah.
There is no commandment against folly. There's no commandment against malice.
Yes.
Those things are the expansion of the Ten Commandments. So he's not really talking about the ten. Well, he is talking about the Ten Commandments, but the reason why the Ten Commandments are important is not because we keep a checklist of things. It's so that we become more like God,
Yeah.
right?
And there's a point in here, it says that evil, he presents a list of vices that start from evil thought. Evil thought ends in evil actions.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Inside out, right?
Tuesday's lesson.
Tuesday's lessons, crumbs for the dogs.
And we're asked to read Mark 7, verses 24 to 30, and see what important lessons are found in this story.
Okay, so it says Jesus left that place.
Why did he leave? Things are becoming a little
It get a little hot
dangerous
down.
down there.
It's getting hot down there. So where he left is Israel, right? So he was outside of
So
Jerusalem, right?
he's
So
in
Jesus
Galilee
left
and he's
that
gonna go
place. That's
north.
right.
He's gonna go
And went to the
northwest.
that's right. Yeah, northwest, right? He and went to the vicinity of Tyre. Tyre, parenthetically, is a Gentile area.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So this is the Tyre is part of Samaria.
Yes.
And we remember from the woman at the well, she's like the Samaritans and Jews,
Yeah.
we don't get down like that. And so he's going to Samaria. And this is not his first time. So he entered a house and did not want anyone to know it. Yet he could not keep his presence secret. Even the Gentiles know who he is. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an evil spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Yes, Lord, she replied, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone.
So she's arguing with Jesus and she wins. She's
She's the only one who's done it.
she's begging for a little bit of his mercy, right?
She's saying, Jesus, break me off a little something, something. Right?
Okay. So why does Jesus seemingly respond so harshly to this woman? As opposed to seemingly calling her a dog in so many ways, calling her
He
a
is
dog.
calling her a dog, and directly he's calling her a dog. There's no question about it. Um, Everything that Jesus does is intentional. And
Yeah.
so
But
you have to ask, well, what's the intent of this communication?
he doesn't
So,
openly explain it. He doesn't openly explain it, but two characteristics in his response to her suggest what
yeah,
he's teaching.
right.
Yes,
So,
he said, I like this part. He says that the children should be fed first. If there is a first, it seemed logical that there would be a second, the author says.
that sounds like there's some hope there, right?
Yeah.
Right. And then it says the other characteristic is that Jesus uses a diminutive form of the word dog, not meaning puppies, but rather in context. Dogs are allowed inside the house in contrast to street dogs. So the Greek word for dogs that he uses, I'm going to mess this Greek up. It's canaria. Okay, that means a little dog. It means a domesticated dog. It's a pet dog.
Another wild street dog. Another wild.
Right. Now, a
Yeah.
wild street dog is Keon. Keon, so Philippians chapter 2, Paul is talking about those who are pushing um, circumcision, and he says those dogs, those mutilators of the flesh, right? That's Keon. I believe it's Revelation chapter 21, or was it 22, where Jesus is quoted by John talking about the kinds of people who are not going to make it into the kingdom. The murderers, the adulterers, the liars, and then he says all the dogs. Those are Keons, but not uh Canarians or whatever the word is. So this domesticated dog, this pet dog, this beloved dog, that's what he's referring to. And I'm not a really big pet person, but I know people who really are. They treat their pets like family.
Yeah,
And the
there's
implication is you're a pet in the family, right? And so I've had dogs before. I feed my dogs. I don't feed straight street dogs.
big dogs. Yeah,
So a dog is entitled to
the-
food
yeah,
by the owner.
by
And
the
so
owner.
the implication that Jesus was saying, okay, you know what? I can't give it to you first, but you are entitled. And she understands that. She
Yeah, it says
understands
here
what he's
that
saying.
yes. She says that, her response, she replies, Lord, yet even the dogs on the table eat from the children's crumbs. What does her response tell us of how she understood what Jesus was saying?
Well, so the lesson says, just as the dog was in the house under the table, so she was at Jesus's feet pleading for her daughter. So according to the quarterly, she claimed a dog's right to the food that fell on the floor. And so what she's saying, I'll take whatever you got.
To feed the children first.
You do what you got to do. I'll be
Then
here.
second is for the pets.
I'm waiting.
In
I'm
other
waiting.
words,
Whatever you got for me, I'll take whatever you got.
yes, yes,
And
yes,
so you I think you've got the fuller context in Desire of Ages. You want to
yes, yes. Yes, I'll do that. I just want to say that, uh beneath the surface here, um, Jesus is so excited that this woman found him and he offers her a place at the table, right? And he promises her, not only does he give her a place at the table and crumbs, he promised her a full dinner, right? And so she takes it further. She's saying, Jesus, her daughter, the healing of her daughter is just a little crumb here in this whole big loaf.
yes.
There's plenty of room at the
There's
table for more
more. There's
pets.
more.
And Jesus is really getting to the Gentiles. Remember, he's going to Gentile country,
That's
right?
right.
And he wants his disciples to understand that he's teaching is a lesson to them too, right? So the Zyvader says that uh Jesus knew. I guess the thought is, how did Jesus know about this woman? Was it just happenstance, or did he know in advance that the woman's daughter was possessed by a demon? How did he get to this woman? How, in this area of Tyre and Sidon, that's all the way in northwest. He left all the way down and went northwest. Did he go specifically for this lady, or what happened? And the Zive Ages, page 400, says Christ knew this woman's situation. He knew that she was longing to see him, and he placed himself in her path. By ministering to her sorrow, he would give a living representation of the lesson he designed to teach. For this, he had brought his disciples into this region. And this is so important. He said he desired them to see the ignorance that existed in the cities and villages close to the land of Israel. The people who had been given every opportunity to understand the truth were without knowledge of the needs of those around them. In other words, they were called to preach the gospel
Yes.
and not set a barrier, a petition between themselves and the Gentiles. And so they made no effort to go to these people who were in darkness. And the petition wall, which the Jewish pride had erected, shut even the disciples from sympathy with the heathen world. But these barriers were about to be broken down. That's why he
And,
went there.
yeah, and
Yeah.
so we know this to be true because in the book of Acts we see all of this drama that's going on between the Gentiles and the Jewish Christians, and
Yeah.
because Mark was not an eyewitness to these things, he's only writing down what Peter told him. So this means that the lesson that Jesus wanted to teach, Peter understood it because he recalls this message or this story to Mark. Now, Dr. Cox, we only have 5 minutes. We got 2 days
Oh,
left,
wow.
so we got a
Wow.
boogie.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So we just want to say that, that Jesus knew, and he understood, and we have to break down these barriers in order to reach people, because that's
Yes.
what Jesus did here, right?
Yes.
Okay.
All
So
right.
let's move on to Wednesday's lesson, tongue tied,
Yeah,
Mark
so
seven
Wednesday's
31 to
lesson, we
37.
won't read the scriptures, but there's a story of a man who
Yeah.
is deaf and mute. And so while Jesus had moved on from Tyre and Sidon,
Down to
he
the
now
down
finds
to
his
the
way in a convoluted pathway to Decapolis. And Decapolis is where he met the man who had the legion of demons, right?
right.
So he's back in town now,
They
right?
threw him out because it was bad for the
But
economy.
he's
Yeah, the
back.
2,000 pigs died.
He's back, right? And so he heals this deaf and mute man by touching his ears, spitting on his fingers, touching the man's tongue, and sighing. So, what is the significance of this healing process, Dr. Cox?
Well, he touched the tongue, and it says, and he was able to heal the restore hearing, and he was able to give the blind man back his sight. And really, it says this man is an example of the condition of the people. So many people. He
Yes,
couldn't do anything. He can't. He can heal you. He can give you back your sight. He can do, but he can't change your heart. Right? Just like
right,
people of Nazareth, they didn't believe because of their faith. He could do nothing there. So
right. And
he
so,
wants to do a lot for his people, but he can't because what? We won't let him in. We
but
won't
we
let him do.
but we see Christ's compassion
Yeah.
because he touches the places of the man's need. The physical touch is important. The
But he
side,
can't open. He can't open his unbelieving heart. He can't open our unbelieving hearts. Yeah.
no, and that's where the side comes from. That's the exasperation. We're gonna move on to Thursday's,
Thursday's lesson.
okay? Watch out for bad bread. So in the first part of Mark chapter 8, in that region, Jesus feeds 4,000. The important part about this is not, well, one of the important parts about it is the fact that when he fed 5,000, that was in Israel. When he feeds 4,000, this is now in Samaria. So Jesus now is an equal opportunity feeder, right? And
Yeah.
so after he feeds the people, the Pharisees in verse 11, the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply. Here's go sign again, but now he's sighing deeply and said, why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it. Then he left them and got back into the boat and crossed to the other side. Verse 14. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned.
Of
Watch
the
out for
leaven,
the leaven
leaven of
of
the
the
Pharisees
Pharisees and that
and
of
the
Herod.
leaven.
What in the
And
world
they
is going on
reason
here?
among themselves, it's because we have no bread. They didn't
Okay,
get it.
they didn't
Yeah,
get it. They didn't get it. So the
that's
first
right.
point that we want to make is this. There are times when people would ask Jesus for a sign and he would give them a sign. Like sometimes he would give them the sign of Jonah, Jonah being in the belly of the whale for 3 days. But this time the Pharisees asked for a sign. He's like, I'm not going to give you one.
Yeah.
Signs are not that important. What
No.
is important is understanding the deeper meaning of God's words. That's the most important thing. Now, having said that, he warns the disciples against the leaven of the
The
Pharisees
Pharisees,
and Herod. And once again,
they misunderstood.
leaven, right, they're thinking literally, but he's using symbolic language because the leaven is really not the food of the Pharisees and Herod, but the teachings of the Pharisees and Herod.
I think he's also disappointed with them because they've seen him feed 5,000 and 4,000, and yet they're asking him, they're saying, we
Yes,
have no bread.
right,
Showing that,
right,
yeah, they must at least understand that there are no limitations with God.
right. And so he's disappointed that they're still
Yeah.
so dull. He's disappointed that they're still stuck on the
Yeah.
literal. And then in verses 17 through 19, it says, aware of their discussion, because they were asking this because we have no bread, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you
Yeah.
do you still not
They
see or
understand.
understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the five loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you
Yeah.
pick up? 12, they
But
replied. Then he asked
but
about
go,
the 4,000 and the seven loaves, and he says,
yeah.
"Do you still not understand?" And
Yeah. I mean,
here's the thing.
I think after seeing him do all of that, I would have.
Yes, absolutely.
Come
And
on, come on.
so, then the language that he uses in those texts is very
Yeah.
reminiscent of his criticism of the
Yeah.
people that are outsiders, the
In
people
Mark
who
4,
have,
10 to 12, yeah.
yeah, and we don't have time. Mark 4, 10 through 12, he's talking about
Yeah.
I speak in parables so they may be ever seen but never hearing, ever seen but never understanding and never hearing, not coming to an understanding of the truth, and thereby being saved. And what he's doing is he said, you used to be insiders in Mark chapter 4. Are you now acting like outsiders in Mark
Well,
chapter 8? And so the critical question that he asked them, we have to ask ourselves, do we still not understand?
or who are the unclean people in our community
Absolutely. Now,
that we
you
have
know
to
what?
reach?
Oh,
Yeah.
we've run out of time. This has been
Okay.
such a wonderful lesson, and we want
It
to
really was. It really was.
yeah, and we
Yeah.
want to be
Yeah.
respectful of our time. We just want to wish you a happy Sabbath. We thank you for joining us, and we now transition over to seek His face. Happy Sabbath, everyone. We look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
Bye bye.